All right, so usually around this time, it's now July 3rd, but July 1st, we're usually talking about all the free agents that signed. It's a pretty big day in the NHL on any given year. It's Canada Day up in Canada. But this year, it's a little bit different. We'll be taking a look at that in this video. If you like what we're doing here at Goal Line Hockey and want to see the latest news around the NHL, more videos like this, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and a subscribe down below. Let's take a look at how free agency has been affected this year in 2020. So with the pandemic going on, and it's still in full effect, maybe not to the same extent, but at least for the NHL, we haven't seen hockey return. So there's a couple of factors. We'll be looking at that in this video as well. It's kind of a mishmash video here today because we're going to be looking at how the CBA agreement is going on right now between the players and the NHL, how they want to bring the Olympics back in 2024 and 2026. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that, but it's going to be quite interesting to see how this all turns out. I mean, how this is also affecting free agency as well. We'll be looking at that here first. So we're going to take a look at the top 15 pending free agents. And we're going to look at the status of them with their team, the likeliness that they stay with their team, or if they end up leaving. So we're going to start off looking at the Vancouver Canucks right shot defenseman, Chris Tanev. Now, I think the Vancouver Canucks would like to keep Chris Tanev, but the fact that the salary cap is not moving up this season, which is also a big part of this as well, the fact that the cap may not move up for another 3 or 4 years hurts a team like the Vancouver Canucks and the Toronto Maple Leafs expecting the salary cap to go up. Unfortunately, that is not going to be happening. And unfortunately, for a guy like Chris Tanev, Jacob Markstrom there in Vancouver, Tyler Toffoli, who is actually 14 in our list here. So those 3 guys there in Vancouver, it's going to be difficult for the Canucks to sign all 3 of those guys unless they take a pay cut or they're just not willing to get a raise, which I find that hard to believe. But that may be a possible scenario. I think if the Vancouver Canucks can find a way to, if they have a good season here, and, maybe they don't, obviously if they won the Stanley Cup, I think they would be more willing to leave because they've already won that cup. But if they have a solid, a playing round here against the Minnesota Wild, they maybe go to the second or third round of the playoffs this year. Watch out, because the Vancouver Canucks may be able to keep these guys, and we know how solid they're going to look. I think they still need some help on that defense. They've got the right guys there, but I think the depth with Tanev, I think it's a huge loss if they lose him in free agency this year. Now moving to number 13, because we already talked about Tyler Toffoli at 14. Number 13, Carolina Hurricanes right shot defenseman Sammy Bate. Now, Sammy Bate is interesting because he was a player with the Carolina Hurricanes where he was just a depth piece. And, I mean, it costed the Carolina Hurricanes a pretty penny because they gave the New Jersey Devils a pretty nice load of draft picks in that trade. So, not really sure what was going on there, but Carolina Hurricanes wanted to add some depth to their blue line before the playoffs here. We'll see how that works out for them. I don't think he's going to stay with the Carolina Hurricanes at the conclusion of this playoffs or whatever format ends up happening. I don't see him staying with the Carolina Hurricanes. This is just a move to try and acquire depth, and that's really it. So now we move up to number 12 as we take a look out in Pittsburgh as Alex Galchenyuk. Now this is interesting because Gauch, we know the story. It didn't really work out so well with him down in Arizona. Didn't really work out in Montreal. So now he gets a chance with Pittsburgh, and this is a huge opportunity for Galchenyuk, and I think this is a guy that you've got to keep your eye on. He's going to be a difference maker in the NHL, and he's not going to be to the extent that people were hoping he could be, but he's still a solid asset. I think the Pittsburgh Penguins want to keep him, but they're going to have to decide between him or Justin Schultz, who we'll talk about here in a minute, but Justin Schultz as well, the right shot defenseman, is available. So now we move on to number 11 as we take a look at probably one of the better goaltending prospects here, Robin Lehner. Now, Robin Lehner is with the Vegas Golden Knights as he was traded by the Blackhawks at the NHL trade deadline. But let's be honest, it doesn't look good for him staying with the Vegas Golden Knights considering how close to the cap they are already. And not to mention that the cap will not be moving up. I find it almost impossible for them to keep the tandem of Marc-Andre Fleury and Robin Lehner at this point. As disappointing as that is, I really would have liked to see him become the starter there in Vegas, but I don't think it's going to work out. Unless they're able to move out a couple of contracts or figure out a way to get that done. If they can't do that, I believe Robin Lehner will be hitting the free agent market for the third consecutive free agency. So now we look at number 10 as we've got Torrey Krug. Now, Torrey Krug obviously is the 10th best player on this list. There's no specific order to this. We're just going down the list of how much they've made last season. So, Torrey Krug, yeah, I think he's going to stay in Boston. I think Boston is going to do everything in their power to keep Torrey Krug. There's been talk they may be willing to trade a guy like Jake DeBrusk in a move to make sure they keep a guy like Torrey Krug on their blue line. So I think that's quite interesting. And considering the a couple of guys that they have there, specifically on the blue line, I'm not shocked if they would have let Torrey Krug go, but I think they want to keep him as much as possible. Not that Jake DeBrusk isn't a great player for them in the top 6, but they have guys down in the depth that could move up if they need to, and they don't have to lose Torrey Krug. All right, so now we look at another player here, Justin Schultz. We talked about him earlier with the Pittsburgh Penguins. This is a guy that I believe the Pittsburgh Penguins will do everything in their power to keep. That blue line is looking weaker and weaker by the year there in Pittsburgh, and they really need to keep Justin Schultz at all costs. And I think that's a huge part of the agenda for Jim Rutherford this summer. We'll see if he can get that done with Justin Schultz. I don't know. The salary cap is tough there in Pittsburgh, but I think they're going to do everything in their power to make that go through. So now we move on up to Mikko Koivu with the Minnesota Wild. Now they decided not to trade him at the trade deadline. It seemed like they might have had a deal with the New York Islanders in the works, but he did not want to waive his no-trade clause for the New York Islanders, so that didn't end up working out. And we end up seeing Mikko Koivu stay with the Wild, and it seems like maybe he signs another 1 or 2 year deal somewhere. That could be an option here for Koivu. Or he decides to just hang him up this year. We'll have to wait and see what happens, especially with the whole pandemic and stuff. He may decide just for the sake of his family and everything else that he just is not willing to do this anymore. He doesn't want to take the risks of anything affecting his family. He may just call it quits sooner rather than later. So now we look at right shot defenseman up in Toronto, Tyson Barrie. Tyson Barrie has really had a resurgence under new head coach there in Toronto ever since they let go of Mike Babcock. It has been a much better story there for Tyson Barrie. Now I think he will leave the Toronto Maple Leafs. I just think there's too much going on there in Toronto for them to find a way to keep him on the roster unless they move out a guy like Kasperi Kapanen or one of those guys up front, which I don't think they're going to be willing to do. That's where you see a guy like Tyson Barrie move. They eventually have Timothy Liljegren, Rasmus Sandin. Those guys are just going to fill the role that Tyson Barrie has left and at a lot cheaper price than Barrie. So now we move up to Granlund, who had a pretty solid season this year with the Nashville Predators from the Minnesota Wild trade. This is a good pickup here for the Nashville Predators. He's played fairly well there. I think they're going to try and keep him, but again, with the amount of centers they have, it may be an interesting move. I would really like to see him stay there in Nashville. He's been a huge part of their top 6. I think that's a guy that they really want to keen in on keeping this summer. I think that's on the agenda here for David Poile, to make sure he keeps Granlund. So now we move up to the Edmonton Oilers. Third line center at this point, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, a former first overall pick. He's been with the Oilers the entire time through the oil change and through everything that's gone on since then. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins has been through it all there with the Edmonton Oilers, and I think the Oilers see him as a very valuable asset at that third line center. Teams are always looking for those top 3 guys in their lineup. Look at the Pittsburgh Penguins, like we were just talking about. They finally found out Chenyuk. They wanted Pajot a couple years ago. You're always looking for that really solid center depth. And keeping a guy like Nugent-Hopkins has to be high on the agenda. And considering they're probably going to lose a guy like Andreas Athanasiou if Ken Holland can't figure out a way to keep him. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens. But I think it's going to be quite interesting to see what happens there with Nugent-Hopkins. So now we look at Taylor Hall. Taylor Hall is probably one of the bigger names on this list. I think his value is definitely degraded since he went to the Arizona Coyotes. He was a big trade piece back in December before the new year, but things have really not worked out so well for him in Arizona. He's been able to get the team into the 2014 playoffs, wouldn't have made the top 16, but the fact that they're in this playoffs, they have an opportunity, right? But I'm not a huge fan of, it seems like everywhere Taylor Hall goes, he struggles, except that one season in New Jersey. So we'll see what happens with Taylor Hall. it's going to be interesting. I think his value definitely got ripped apart this past season with his time in New Jersey and in Arizona. But we'll have to wait and see. I think teams will be willing to pay a high price for him. So we'll see what happens. Now we got Corey Crawford, the goaltender from the Chicago Blackhawks. And I think he's a solid backup option at this point. Teams have to be wary of his recent injury history. He's been out with injuries over the past couple of years. He's getting up there in age. He's a great mentor for a young goaltender like I've been talking about recently. I've been talking a lot about the New Jersey Devils being a great fit for a guy like Corey Crawford. He is that culture that they really need there in Jersey, that winning culture. And he could help out a young goaltender like Mackenzie Blackwood continue to develop into a starting goaltender. So now we look at another goaltender as we are heading up to Washington, looking at Stanley Cup champion Braden Holtby. Now, Braden Holtby is one of the bigger names on this list. I don't feel like a lot of people are talking about Holtby. I feel like he's a little bit overrated. I think a lot of people overrate what he really is there in Washington, but he is a very good goaltender. He won with the Washington Capitals. He won a couple of Calder Cups in the American Hockey League with the Hershey Bears in the American League. So he has a winning resume, and I think teams will definitely be looking at that. You've got to think the Edmonton Oilers will be all in on a guy like Braden Holtby. The Minnesota Wild could be looking there as well. You've got a couple of teams that may be looking in that market for a Braden Holtby. So we'll have to wait and see what happens, but Braden Holtby, I don't believe, will be with the Washington Capitals, considering they have Ilya Samsonov in the system. He was the backup last season for Braden Holtby. And down the stretch, they were playing 50-50, and you could argue it was probably Samsonov's job to gain. So now the top guy on the list, and that's why I'm wearing a St. Louis Blues jersey. We're talking about their captain, Stanley Cup champion, Alex Pietrangelo. Now, all the rumors about him going to the Toronto Maple Leafs and this and that, I don't buy it. I believe Alex Pietrangelo is going to stay with the St. Louis Blues. I think the Blues are going to do everything in their power, like we talked about earlier in this, with teams moving out contracts, possibly a guy like Jake DeBrusk in Boston to sacrifice so they could keep Torrey Krug. I think we're going to see something like that happen here with Alex Pietrangelo. Now, whether that's, we saw them move out Robbie Fabry to the Detroit Red Wings during the season. Did they move out, maybe a Steen contract or a Jaden Schwartz to make sure they keep Alex Pietrangelo? I don't know, but I feel like that's something that the St. Louis Blues will be exploring, those options this summer. So that's it. Let me know in the comment section down below, what are your top rated free agents in this draft class? Who did I miss that maybe I should have talked about more? Honestly, I think all 15 of these guys, again, like I said in the beginning of the video, this is no specific order. It's based off of the money that they made last season. And, you look at some of these names. Taylor Hall, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, former first overall picks, Alex Galchenyuk, a former third overall pick. So we're looking at some pretty solid players. Now, they obviously haven't turned into the players that they were expected to be back in their draft day, but still some pretty solid players. Tyler Toffoli, Robin Leonard, Torrey Krug. There's big names out there, and, when are we going to see free agency? We don't really know. The Stanley Cup is projected to be out in October, so maybe sometime in November will be like the November 1st, maybe the new quote-unquote free agency day here in 2020. So we'll see what happens as time moves along. And if you like what we're doing here at Goal Line Hockey and want to see the latest news around the NHL, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe down below. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.